day or so. So what we're going to cover today, what we're going to cover today is ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and we have the 3 discussion questions that are in Snoodle. You guys did a fantastic job on your discussion questions. Continue the good work. The next questions, you're going to find your answers directly out of the lectures and the book, it's a little more. You can always write more. Please feel free to answer other people's stuff or continue the conversation. That is marvelous, and it made my heart sing. All right, so let us talk about Greece. So here's back to our little timeline so that you can kind of see. We're starting kind of the big discussion in Greece because a lot of how we think and consider the world is from Greece. Ancient Greece thought has a huge effect on modern thought and modern thinking. For those of you who have been through your philosophy classes, I hope you talked about the Greeks a little bit. The way we do theater is a Greek way of doing theater. There's a dude that wrote a lot about theater, and it affected how theater was done for a lot of times. Greek art, Greek music, Greek everything has really held sway over Western thought for a very, very long time. Not to say that this is not the only important. The Mediterranean basin is not the only important civilization that is coming up at this time. It is certainly not. China, Japan, the Americas, the northern European barbaric, quote unquote, barbaric tribes, the Mesoamericans. There's stuff happening all over the world. It's just that we sit in Greece and Rome because there is a direct line that can be drawn from then to now in our styles. Little bit closer look at ancient Greece, at ancient Greek timeline. We're gonna start with the Cycladic culture and move forward through the Minoan. Age of Legends. I'm sure you guys have heard of Homer, have heard of the Trojan War. If not, what's wrong with you? The Age of Oedipus, the Age of Heracles, Hercules. At least you might have watched the Disney movie, if not. The Mycenaean culture, and then what we consider the Greek culture is birthed after the destruction of Mycenaean culture by the invasion of the sea peoples. Maybe the Doric, probably unknown sea peoples. We don't have much information about them. And then the Persian Wars, Battle of Marathon, and then after that, Greek culture takes a decline, or Greek civilization declines, Roman civilization inclines, I guess is a good term, rises. Oh, hit the wrong button. Here we go. Oh, there's, so classic period, the Hellenistic period, and then the decline at the sort of the turn of AD, BCE, and AD. So this is a little map, so you can kind of see where we're talking about. Crete, Mycenae is in the main proper of Greece. Delphi, Athens. We're going to talk about Athens a good bit because that's sort of the heart of it. So if you guys have spent Troy, the Trojan War is up there on the upper left. Samothrace, the warriors of Samothrace, Lesbos, Rhodes, the Colossus at Rhodes, the palace at Knossos in Crete. So there's some stuff going on here that if you don't know exactly what they are, you probably have met them in your readings or in your travels through life. At least if you've watched Xena and Hercules, the legend continues from back in the day, you probably have heard of this stuff. So a little overview of Greek civilization. It sort of began about 3000 BCE. There's a whole bunch of little city-states that wealthy civilizations came to be. They weren't an empire by any stretch of the imagination, but we see little bits of this and that. The Cycladic period is 3000, 2000 BCE. It is the Cycladic Islands. If you could take a look at the map, it's that sort of tiny islands in the middle of the Aegean Sea there. There was very much a bridge between Asia and the rest of Europe. Lots of trade was coming through there. Lots of trade from Egypt, lots of trade from Mesopotamia, and it went all over the Mediterranean. The Greeks were a seafaring people. They spent a lot of time on boats. The Minoan Age, about 2000 to 1400 BCE. This is still Bronze Age civilization on the island of Crete. If you look down at the bottom, that's the island of Crete down there. This is the Palace of Knossos. They were, we're going to talk a little bit more about them in a second. But if you have read the Minotaur, the labyrinth and the monster Minotaur that I think it was Jason and Medea, that she gave him the ball of yarn that he sort of trailed through, and found his way to the Minotaur in the center. That's the mythology around the Minoan culture. Mycenaean culture, if you take a look up at the big, between the Ionian Sea and the Aegean Sea, this is right at that crux there. Really high culture, really high cultural achievement. The myth of heroes. This is Menelaus. This is Agamemnon. This is we're gonna go get Helen from Paris in Troy. The Trojan War happened at this time. Gods and men walked together. The story of Ulysses, of Odysseus and the Odyssey happened at this time period. The stories of Hercules happened at this time period. Lots of kind of fantastical stuff that we are hearing about later in time whenever we get into the Greek classical age. So this is sort of the main chunk of the Greek age. So we have the Dark Ages. This is the Mycenaean civilization has fallen, and there's nothing going on. So we see lots of war at this time. They were probably invaded by sea peoples or a Doric civilization. There was civil wars. There was, we're talking about that there is no written or artwork that has lasted at this time. As you can see in that little writing there, Dorian invaders probably had iron weapons that the Mycenaeans did not have. And again, whenever people are conquered, things are destroyed, so we don't have a lot of records from this time. Then we have the Archaic period. This is the beginnings of what we think of as Greek civilization. We're starting to see little warring city-states. We start to see a change in artwork. We're starting to see adaptation of iron tools at this time. And we see the birth of the beginnings of democracy, the birth of the beginnings of city-states. The classical period is the time that we super duper think of whenever we think of Greek civilization. This is the height, the golden age, as we called. It's a system of government under the Athenian statesman Pericles. He was the one that sort of put everything together. This is right after, if you take a look there, the death of the Macedonian king Alexander the Great. We see the greatest of political and cultural heights. Democracy is at its height. The city-state is at its height. Theater and thought. This is the time of Plato. This is the time of Aristotelian thought, Aristotle. This is the time of Sophocles. This is the time of Socrates. So a lot of what we know of as Greek civilization is happening at this time. The Hellenistic period is sort of the weakening of um, the weakening of the Greek stranglehold on the culture and stuff. This is the birth of the um, Roman supremacy. Uh, Greek culture was everywhere. Greek culture fed into the Roman supremacy, the Roman culture, but it was um, sort of falling aside. Again, another map of sort of that is color coded so that you can kind of see the green is the Cycladic culture, the pink is the Minoan culture, and then the Mycenaean culture is the red line and how big that was. The Archaic period forward, Greeks produced innovations in government and made great contributions in art, literature, and science, politics, philosophy. They loved mathematics. Oh my God, the Greeks loved geometry. Just look at any of their statues, look at any of their architecture. The Greeks loved geometry. They loved order. Well, of course, they loved order. Look at democracy. Look at their creation of government. It was all about order. It was about everything in its place. It was about perfection. There's a whole bunch of, whenever we talk about the Greeks, it's not necessarily a monolithic society like we see in the Egyptians, that the Egyptian civilization, the Egyptian peoples, ancient Egyptian peoples were long lineaged. But when we take a look at the Greek people, it is chunks of other societies. So we see a little bit of people from Mesopotamia. We see people from Indo-European. We see invaders. We see this society did not have the protections of Egypt. When we talked about Egypt, we talked about that Egypt had the Nile. Egypt had deserts to protect it, so it didn't have a lot of invaders. It didn't have a lot of changes from outside forces. Greeks did, but Greeks just did it better than everybody else, really. Greece was generally divided into squabbling city-states. Remember, this is Sparta. If you've seen the 300, the Athenians, they were usually ruled by a king. Whenever we take a look at ancient Greek stories, we see kings and queens and mythological figures. Greek society was arranged around the individual. Egyptians was monolithic. It was the king, then the priests, and then everybody else. Mesopotamia is king, priests, tradesmen, everybody else. Greeks love individuality. They liked, so we're not getting we're getting stories of individual people, not of a people at this time. Greek ornamentation, architecture, and arts and clothing focused on individualism. Loved it. You'll notice that as we go through the images in this lecture, that the statues are about individuals being grandiose. They loved unity. They loved the whole of things. All of the works of art were usually complete within themselves. Proportion, everything was sized within itself. Even if something like the Parthenon, this huge Greek building, was perfectly sized within itself. There was not anything out of balance, out of proportion. And balance, again, is really important. Whenever we talk about art, these are the ways that we talk about art, and we got it from the Greeks. Emotional versus intellectual, rational versus irrational, instinctive versus planned, Apollo versus Dionysius. Apollo is the god of the sun and of order, and of medicine. Dionysius is the god of drink and licentiousness. And you see that in a lot of the festivals in Greece, that they would lead a very ordered society, but then once every couple of months they would have a festival that sort of they go crazy. And that is a common theme that we see in a lot of the societies, especially the more rigid societies that we'll have coming up, is that they generally have very straight-laced and then a crazy party. Um, they loved perfection. They loved athletes. They loved mathematics. They loved seeing the world put exactly where it should be. And if, for those of you who have read any of the Greek philosophers, you'll notice that that is something that they talk about. They want to put everything right where it belongs. Aristotle wrote a book about called Poetics about drama, and it is one of the books that I had to read when I was in graduate school. And it set out, so this is poetry is the most important part of drama, and then music, and then acting, and then gesture, and then this, and then spectacle, and then this. So it was very specifically laid out how drama should be constructed, and why, and what happens if it's not. I mean, we've discovered that he was wrong, but it's a great example of this sort of idea of perfection that the Greeks loved. This is one of the statues that kind of show this beauty, this sort of proportionality. Everything is in its place. If you were to take a ruler, print this out and take a ruler and draw lines, the arm is perfectly proportioned. The back of the thigh is perfectly proportioned. There are perfect triangles. I am not a mathematician, but I bet you if you do some math, you will find this sort of perfection. So how do we know what we know about Greek, about the Greeks, especially image work? For early Greek cultures, it was frescoes, painted and plastered walls, mosaics, face paintings, and statuary. For late Greek cultures, extensive statuaries. The Greeks loved statues. They loved painting on vases. They loved pottery, bas-relief carvings, and they wrote about it. They wrote from the Classic Age on. They wrote the Golden Age on. They wrote extensively about the world and how they inhabited it. Some of the general clothing features. I'm going to have a drink. Hang on. Some general clothing features. There is a vast difference between early Greek styles, the Mycenaean and the Minoan, and later Greek styles, the actual what we consider Greek styles. Minoan and Mycenaean clothing only survive by what we see in statues and stuff. We don't really have any extant pieces. Even the language that we believe the Minoan Mycenaeans used disappeared. There's no writing left. Again, destruction is destruction. Early Greek clothing was generally stiff, really decorated, elaborate, sophisticated, ritualistic. The later Greek clothing was simple. It was a swath of fabric that was draped around or wrapped around or layered. There was minimal sewing. Again, part of this is because the later Greeks were interested in the physical form, the perfection of the physical form, and just a wrap is enough to show off the physical form. Some of the fabrics that Greeks used, the early Greeks wore animal skins. Greeks primarily wore woolens and linens and silk. Linens were probably imported from Egypt until they started making their own linen fabric. In silk, there are two. I read two things. I think in our book it says that probably they imported it from India. But also, there might have been a native silkworm that it was creating fiber on one of the islands, maybe Crete. Linen was also woven, just like the Egyptians, woven to coarse and fine textures with near transparency. And, the creation of fiber, the creation of fabrics, was the wife's main responsibility. There was a definite line between men's lives and women's lives, that men's lives was very public. They spend a lot of their time outdoors, a lot of time talking. a lot of time governing, a lot of time in trade. Women's lives was sort of prescribed to the household. So they were the managers of the house. They produced the food, they produced textiles. They didn't really go on out and buy a tunic. They made it. Weaving, particularly, was an important job for a woman. Even queens spun and wove. I have a misplaced apostrophe there. Even queens spun and wove. If you guys have read the Odyssey, that was the story of Penelope, who was Odysseus's wife. And Odysseus had been missing for 10 years with the Trojan War, and he was on his way back and went missing for another 10 years. And she, being ever faithful, told her suitors that she would make the decision about who she was going to remarry. She was a queen, so of course she had a million suitors, whenever she was done weaving Odysseus's funeral shroud. So she set her son Telemachus out, keep an eye on your dad, keep an eye for your dad. And she sat and she wove. And every night she would weave a chunk. Every night she would take it out. Clever woman. Here's some images of women spinning and weaving. There's a better version of this in our book. We'll notice at the top left, they're creating roving, which is how we clean the wool, how we make it into spinnable lengths. You'll notice that the second one, they're folding, the second group of women on the very top, they're folding the fabrics, but the third group of women on the left of that top one, you'll notice what she's using looks very familiar to something that you guys have in your fiber box. That is a drop spindle and distaff. The thing in her left hand is called a distaff, and that's where you kind of wrap the stuff that you're weaving from, and the bottom is the drop spindle. You'll notice down at the bottom, I gave you guys a link in the PowerPoint yesterday to a weighted loom. That's a weighted loom. That's what's at the bottom there, and that is weaving. And the fabrics that the Greeks created was very fine. It was not sort of primitive at all. It was highly decorated, highly patterned, elaborate, because this is what women did from morning till night. As you noticed in the book, I believe in the book, it talked about that they probably sent out for dyeing, because the mordants and dyeing smells. Even our modern dye stuffs, like Rit dye and things, they have an odor, and that's with a chemical dye. This is dyeing is pretty stinky back then, so they would send it out. They would have tradesmen, probably men, that took care of the dyeing for a family of the fabric. Greeks, like everybody else before, like everybody who we have coming up, were very highly ornamented. We see necklaces, earrings, pendants, rings, bracelets, hair ornaments. When we get into the Romans, hair kind of becomes the big thing about an outfit when we get into the Romans. But elaborate hair ornaments. This is, once again, we have money at this time, but this is another way to show your wealth, is to ornament people. And, you know, we like to be pretty. Here's some interesting pieces of Mycenaean jewelry. You notice that it is spirals. You might have seen that before in some of our Celtic pieces that we saw in the prehistoric lecture. You'll notice that there's figures. They're creating figures. They're creating gold masks, so death masks at this time. Crowns, they're doing repoussé. They're doing a little cloisonné. It's mostly just finely beaten gold because there was a great amount of gold in the Greek ground. Not a lot of silver. They had to import silver, so we won't see a lot of silver going on, but there's lots of gold. And you'll notice in this one there's a little bit of cloisonné, a little bit of inlay. Inlay is whenever you set gemstones, or you set pieces of glass into, and it is not heated. It's kind of glued and bent into the gold. Early jewelry pieces, we see a little bit of Babylonian influence. The filigree patterns, you see the bees down. I absolutely adore this piece down on the right, and that's one of the motifs that we saw in Babylonian jewelry. You'll see that it has a little granulation, a little bit of repoussé down there. Men and women wear thin necklaces and earrings. Men wore adorned loincloths. Again, this was probably for ritualistic purposes. Necklaces and made out of semi-precious jewelry. So we're seeing gold, silver, some silver, and we're seeing sort of precious stones and highly colorful pieces. So it's gold with lots of color to it. Again, this is the gold ring showing bull jumping, and when we get to the Minoan culture, we're going to talk a little bit about bull jumping and kind of little Egyptian style over here. This also, this sort of gold on the left also reminds me a little bit of the Mayans, a little bit of Mesoamerican styling as well. They work predominantly in gold, and it was a lot of figurative art. During the Archaic period, Greek men only wore a couple little functional pieces, but women wore a lot of gold and jewels. Lots of functional pieces, so holding their chitons together with fibula. So these are two different types of fibula. Think of fibula as sort of like a shaw pin. So if any of you have worn, your grandmas wear a shaw, they'll often put a pin through it so that it doesn't fall open. And that's kind of what fibula is. It's kind of like fancy ass safety pins. Here's a gold crown, a bit of a necklace. You notice gold, gold, gold. Beauty and grooming in the Greeks. Early Greeks there wasn't a lot of makeup at the early Greeks, but as we move forward to like the 400 BCE, we're starting to see makeup come in a little more regularly. Again, lead, red rouge, vermilion, mulberry, ochre, coal. Once again, that sort of sulfide pigment, galena, and then they'll even use soot. For lower class women, will even use soot or lamp black, which is like the leavings of burning oil, and they use pigments as well. And you see on the left down there, she has a little bit. Her lips are colored and her cheeks are colored. Hair was really important to Greeks. Wasn't put up elaborately as the Romans, as we will see, but it had sort of a religious significance. So whenever somebody you cared about died, or somebody you were supposed to care about died, they would pull their hair out and they would cut it off or shave it. We also see this practice today in India. That's part of people in India believe hair has a religious significance. So often men and women will donate their hair to the temple as a sacrifice, and then that hair is sold to make wigs for Western societies. A lot of the natural, if it's dark, a lot of natural wig hair that you see comes from India. A bride's hair was cut on her wedding day to symbolize her humility. That it was a good bit of what Greek life was like for women, was about being humble. Young boys didn't cut their hair until their hair appeared, and then they would sacrifice it. So hair had a mystical purpose. Hairstyles for women, it seemed similar. They just let it grow long. These are both Mycenaean images, or one's Minoan, one's Mycenaean, and you'll notice it's just kind of like long locks that they have curled, or they have put into braids and let fall naturally. Around the 6th century, about 600 BCE, men wore their hair cut short, and sometimes they put things in. Again, this is the golden age. So again, the ideals of masculinity have sort of been set at this time during the golden age in Greece. That if you wore trinkets, if you had long hair, it was feminine, effeminate. Um, and there was two different types. There was kepos. This is an unkempt Hectorian style. That it was a fall of curls, and then this Theseid was strands of hair worn short at the forehead, while the rest hung down longer. We see beards sometimes, sometimes not. Philosophers and older men during the classical age were the only one that wore beards. Politicians would wear beards to give them some seriousness. Young girls let their hair fall freely. Um, and often it was pulled back. Older women pulled back into chignons, and they would put decoration in it. Both sexes dyed their hair using other colors. Hair was generally dark or black, just like Greek people today. So they would dye it or paint it to be other colors. And here's some looks at some Greek hairstyles. Pulled back. Keep this image in your head. We're going to see this again coming up repeatedly because of sort of Western European love of Greek society. We're going to see this over and over and over again in some men's styles. Footwear, sandals. Sandals were the thing. There's some evidence that about the wear in some Greek houses, that the wearing, how stairs get worn down, that they didn't probably wear shoes inside. They probably left them outside and walked around barefoot inside. So there is 4 basic silhouettes that we can talk about whenever we talk about Greek clothing. So we have the Cretan Minoan, we have the Mycenaean, we have the Archaic, and the Classical Hellenistic. So Cycladian, let's start back with the Cycladian real quick, just because it's pretty fantastic. Marble figurines are the most important legacy of the Cycladians. That's those Cyclades islands that we looked at. We don't have a lot of evidence. You'll notice that the statues probably were wearing loincloths. And you'll notice that the most important figure on these statues is the nose. You'll notice that we get a little more realistic as we go on. And there's a belt around the seated figure's waist. Probably was a loincloth. They were probably wearing just loincloths at this time, or they were naked. So we come forward to the Minoan Crete. I'm going to keep pronouncing that wrong. The first European civilization. The thing that we have existing from them is the palace at Knossos. And that is the images that we'll see here. You'll notice that it's highly colorful, it's gorgeous. It is the center for bronze production. They had advanced techniques and mines that had a lot of bronze in it. And there was the immigrants from the Cyclades brought new navigational skills, so they were able to do lots of trade. The Minoans were pretty remarkable. We don't know much about them, but all we really have left are the images on the walls of their palaces. This fantastic visual record. They had their society was unlike the later Greeks that we're going to talk about. Their society was based around trade and bureaucracy. Not a lot of war. We don't see any weapons or very few weapons in their frescoes, in their images. You'll notice they had a drawing of this image in our book, and it's of 2 women and a man. And you notice that the one woman is wearing, the 2 people on the very end are wearing sort of almost almost Mesopotamian Kanakis skirts, so fluffy skirts wrapped about the waist, and then the two people in the middle, one female, one male, and this is probably sort of a ritual. Libation bearers, so people are bringing things to give to the gods, that they're wearing fuller skirts. The Minoans were pretty remarkable. The Cretan society, really, the people of Crete really loved leisure. And a lot of their society was focused on leisure and sport and boxing and enjoyment and a spectator society. So we'll see in the picture down here in this slide that this is bull jumping. So what they would do is they would release a bull and they would leap over it from front to back. And you'll notice that both men and women participated in this, wearing sort of a loincloth and or like gym shorts almost, and little boots, high boots. Women will often wear breastbands for these as well. But it's kind of this spectacular sort of sport. And you'll notice that it's not about death. It's about gymnastics at this point. It's not about killing the bull. It is about jumping over the bull, showing off that you have the physical prowess to do this. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot extant. We have frescoes. There's no surviving clothing because moisture is the death of clothing. The specimens have rotted away. What we do know is from frescoes and stuff. Remember artistic license. We're not looking at what it is, but what they wished it to be or that they imagined it to be. So we have these men are wearing loincloths. These are libation bearers as well. Men and women probably wore just decorated loincloths or short skirts, short wrap skirts. We don't see any sewing at this point, so it's probably just a piece of fabric that is wrapped around. Not really worried about nudity. They didn't really have to worry about it because it was warm. We see some of women's garb. We see these long skirts with a bodice where their breasts are bare. And you'll notice that the skirts are pretty elaborately decorated, that it is not just a wrap skirt, but it's also a wrap skirt with layers or a wrap skirt with ruffles. They also wore a girdle that cinched the waist tight. You'll notice in both of these images that the waists are pretty tight. There was probably a cincher, a corselet that they wore to help make that the small waistband, the wasp waist. You'll notice that they also wore this sort of bodice that tied at the waist but left the breast bare with some puffy sleeves and sort of tight fitting across the back. Take a look at that hair though, the highly decorated loose locks of hair, and highly decorated white faces with decorated eyes. Again, maybe the paint washed off, maybe it was, you'll notice that there's a little paint still extant, maybe they were a little pinker, but still it's pretty white. And here is a procession, the men wearing wrap skirts and loincloths, the women wearing long layered skirts or ruffled skirts, the bodices with bare breasts, bare chests. Here's a couple more, again, of the layered skirts. You'll notice that the one the one on the left, that she has makeup on, so kohl, dark eyes, little bit of rouge on the cheeks, and red lips, and earrings and such. So a lot of the female costumes required some sewing or some layering. And it's kind of interesting, these styles of clothing, that these are what they put their goddesses in, so or the priestesses in, so we can extrapolate back what people really wore at this time. Sort of like a wasp waist with a bell skirt was kind of the standard of the time, and a bit of an apron in the front, probably echoing men's loincloths, that same sort of chunk of fabric. We saw that yesterday in the Egyptian as well, that they had this sort of a placket in the front, to draw the eye maybe, or to show off fineness of material. So maybe that piece was highly decorated or of a different types of material so that you could show off your waist, etc. You'll notice that the goddess on the right, or the priestess on the right, is wearing that sort of cutaway bodice that leaves the breasts bare. The girdle around the waist that is very tight-fitting, the apron, and a layered or ruffled skirt that could be just wrapped or probably was sewn at this point. Again, even workmen are wearing layered skirts. You'll notice it's a skirt and skirt and skirt, or ruffled skirts, highly decorated, highly patterned, and a sort of a flat cap with a big earring. So this is a young girl gathering saffron. This is one of my favorite images of Minoan culture. And again, bare breasts, bodice. And looks like the bodice in this one is a bit sheer. So this might be sheer linen and a bunch of skirts, or a layered skirt. Men generally wore a loincloth, or skirts and loincloths were layered. You'll notice that we have, again, the cinched waist, elaborate hat, fancy hat. So this might have been for ritual purposes, or this might have been a god or a hero, and a loincloth around his waist. A little bit. This is a different one of this exact same style. Again, a woman, makeup, earrings, and this sort of layered skirt that is a little bit see-through. We can kind of see that there. The Mycenaeans, unlike the peaceful Cretes, Mycenaeans loved war. They loved to go out and be pretty warlike. They were also tradesmen. They also traded. They went out and traded with other peoples. They exported jewelry, weapons, utensils, skin ornaments. These are still Bronze Age. We are not looking at iron tools yet. When the Minoan society collapsed, it was absorbed into Mycenaean, and this happened a lot in Greek and Roman. Roman society particularly was really good at absorbing conquered peoples, and we'll talk about that in a second. Much of what we know about Mycenaean culture comes from two sources: Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and an amateur archaeologist at the turn of the last century. Much of what we know is from amateur archaeologists. He founded Troy. That was his big deal. He found Troy in Turkey, and then found a bunch of Mycenaean cities. And this was the mask of, it was not the mask of Menelaus, it was the mask of Agamemnon. Menelaus and Agamemnon were brothers, and they both went and warred on Troy. The Mycenaean costume, really similar to the Minoan culture. Hats and loincloths and skirts and high boots. You see in the warrior in the middle, wearing a high boot. He has a cape on, and tunics, loose cut tunics. And we see that here in the chariot. That's what we would consider a tunic. They were probably sewn. And then the warriors on this side are wearing sort of loincloths and helmets. Boxer briefs. Women followed Cretan fashions again, so we can see long flowing locks of hair kind of tied up, the tight bodice, the tight waist, and the layered skirt or ruffled skirt. Again, look at the highly decoration. This might be some artistic license, but often artistic license, when you take away some of it is still left. Okay, so on to the Dark Ages. Greek society disappeared during this time period, during this 400 years. No writing, no crafts, no commercial network, no trade. They stopped going ashore, probably didn't trade with each other. They fell back onto squabbling little uh, tribal uh, tribal communities, probably caused by migration, probably uh, caused by the Dorians, which were the northern barbarians, invasion, infighting, civil war, and unknown sea peoples that came and destroyed. And as we said before, destruction equals destruction of records. Um, Probably fell back to wrap skirts and shawls and tunics and loincloths as their clothing. We have some extant stuff. If you take a look at this, it is of an Egyptian style, though. That is either because we have some Egyptian pieces that Egyptian art that made its way into the Dark Ages, or that it's just a common style that we see at this time. And you'll notice that it has a bit of a simple wrap skirt on. So we come up into the Archaic period at this time. At this point, this is the beginning of the Greek civilization that we're coming up on, the Golden Age. The ancient Greeks were seafaring people, again establishing settlements. So this is whenever we're starting to see this. They're starting to grow back up into the civilization that we're going to see shortly. There's a bit of a change in the art, probably echoing over to Egyptian style, and then hearkening forward to what we're going to see shortly. Interestingly, like the stance is kind of Egyptian. The hair is kind of Mesopotamian in this. Again, very formal, very rigid, and not something that we're going to see shortly in the Golden Age, that their artwork becomes less rigid and more naturalistic. Archaic Greek clothing was tunics and shawls, once again, kind of draped around. Men's clothing remained pretty simple, but we're starting to see the complicated pleats and folds and layers that we're going to see in the Golden Age here in a second. The classical period, this is the apex of Greek civilization, especially in Athens. They were an international superpower. They were full of economic prosperity and cultural flowering. There were two major wars that inspired artists at this time, the two Peloponnesian Wars, and a lot of what we know of from this time is from the Peloponnesian Wars. Fabric was softer in the Archaic period, more pleats, more drapes, more layers. Not a lot of cutting and sewing, mostly involved draping because of their ideals of beauty. Clothing was meant to be subtle, so they didn't really differentiate between the body and the cloth. Again, we're going to see this later, especially right after the French Revolution. My favorite clothing style, the incroyables, the merveilles, they echoed Greek sort of draping of clothing, sometimes to their detriment, but we will talk about that in a couple weeks. The Hellenistic period, this is the last period, begin with Alexander the Great, and then the end of, there's lots of war going on, and the end of the Hellenistic period equals the beginning of the reign of the emperors of Rome. Clothing styles changed gradually during the 4th century. Not a lot of huge changes, but we're starting to see more Roman styles in the Hellenistic period. We're going to see more sleeves, more tunics, and more cutting and sewing. So some specific costume pieces that we see throughout the ages, throughout the Greek age, is the chiton. This is the piece of clothing that Greeks wore. Loincloth was still very prevalent for men and for women, just like underoos are for today. But it is a large rectangular cloth that is wrapped around the body and joined at one side. Sometimes we see long chitons, and the different types of chitons were very much related to the different types of jobs that people were doing. So this charioteer is wearing a very specific type of chiton that was worn by charioteers. This person on the this young man on the left is the type of chiton that was worn by young men. Again, the Greeks had a very formal society with very strict rules about who could do what when. Here is kind of what a couple different types of chiton. This is the one that we, on the left here, this is the one that we kind of see in early society, that it is pinned at both shoulders. It's just a big piece of fabric with a belt and kind of open. It's open on the sides. This is an exomus, kind of a youthful outfit. It is pinned at the shoulder here with a fibula, and kind of draped and pleated and allowed to hang loose with a belt around it. Often this would also be so that they would start up here, it would wrap around, and it would come up here to the top. We might see that in some of these later chitons as well. Women's clothes, we see the Doric peplos and chiton. A peplum, we will see that is the little dangly bit down here. So this is all one huge piece of fabric that comes around, and they hike it up and they belt it underneath and they belt it over top so that it has this sort of peplum. This is not two pieces of fabric, this is one piece of fabric. Simple rectangle of woven wool cloth, 6 feet wide, probably half the tall as the person wearing it, wrapped around the body, pinned at the shoulders, and then folded at the top, that flaps down over the top, or folded at the waist and flapped down over the waist. The chiton was bordered at the top and bottom with a band of color, so that we would see color here, we would see color here, we'd see a little color here, and a little color here at the bottom. We also see a bit of a shawl on this one. The overfold at the top here, so this is a fold at the top. So this, again, this is one whole piece of fabric. Is called the I'm not going to pronounce that. It's this one right here. I can never pronounce that one right correctly. And you'll see a shawl. You'll notice it's kind of see-through. We see a little bit of curves of the breast. It's about the natural fold of the body. It's about following the hang of the body. A little bit of sandals, lots of decoration, fibula, a bit of a diadem. You notice that the hair is up and held in by a net. When a belt is added, the fabric of the chiton is blessed over it. This is called a kolplos. So this is here again, one big piece of fabric, fibula, hooked up with a belt and a little bit of a peplum, here. So this is the overfold that is it's called a kolplos. A bronze statue of a woman fastening her dress, pin in a pin, and a sort of a person who is recreating them. The Ionic chiton is different from the Doric in 3 ways. It had no overfold. You'll notice that it is just pinned. It is fuller and lighter weight material. One big piece of material starts here, comes all the way around, starts here, and fastened with a whole bunch of fibula on either shoulder, rather than one big pin over one shoulder or 2 big pins on either shoulder. And this, so you see a bunch of little fibulae. Whole bunch of little fibulae in this statue here. It still has the peplum. This is a double peplum. You'll notice that they've folded over twice or hiked up twice. Rather than it folded over this way, they folded it up this way to keep it up. And I think they wrote in the book that it wasn't a big deal that it was too long. They just hiked it up more. You'll notice that we're getting elaborate pleats with the little fibulae, is causing pleats and interesting falls where the fabric hangs and sits. Some of the outer garments that Greeks would wear, the hymation. The hymation kind of becomes our toga later. This is either worn by people who go outdoors a lot, this kind of like an overcoat almost, or it was worn just by philosophers. You can tell he's a philosopher because he has a beard. And it was just a big wrap of fabric, so it came around and it came down over the over the shoulder. And the different drapes depending on the occasion, the wearer, and the status of the wearer. And we'll see that a whole bunch in Romans. Romans, again, loved rules, and if what color stripe you had on your toga equates to what kind of status you had in your life. Here's a bunch of different types of women's hymations. This one particularly, you'll notice it's huge. It's up and over and up and over. Women wore veils at this time, often to sort of put paid to their status that they were supposed to be invisible in a public life. So they would wear veils. They would wear hoods that they could then cover their face. And it was probably, they think it might have been imported from Mesopotamian society. The pharos, this is the light linen shawl that we saw earlier that you could either pin or just take of a scarf. It's kind of like the pashmina that we have today, this sort of insanely long scarf. I wore one into school today. The chlamys is kind of athletes would wear this. It's sort of once again, a long piece of fabric that pinned at the shoulder. And then you would wear other things underneath it, or nothing at all underneath it. Kind of like a small blanket, and you could use it as a blanket as you wish. Some of the hats, the petasos was a brimmed crown hat. Both men and women wore this. And then the pylos, which is the working men's hat, almost like a fez type hat. And here's some modern echoes. Again, we will see this sort of fabric this sort of draping come back again and again and again. But you'll notice that these are 2000, 2003, the same sort of pinned at the shoulders, long pleated drape with a decorative band. Long at the shoulders, pleated drape, long, decorative at the band, wearing sandals. This is 1903 sort of dress, again, very much like what we saw earlier in the Greek clothing, sort of overlay and long drapey. These are all three are fortuni. We talked about fortuni whenever we took a look at some of the modern echoes in the Egyptian style. Again, his marvelous, 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 marvelous pleats and tassels. Again, Elisab, haute couture, the line, so it's up with a peplum and a long skirt with a peplum made of one piece of fabric, and again, a peplum gown.